So, there's a story from Japan that spread online and honestly shocked a lot of people. At first, most people thought it was fake because it sounds like something between a psychological experiment and a movie script. A man disappeared from society for almost 20 years. No real conversations, no friends, no job, no normal social life. Just complete isolation. And then one day, after 2 decades of silence, something strange happened. He spoke again. But the shocking part is not that he spoke, it's what he spoke. The sentence came out in English, not Japanese. English. Now, imagine that for a second. You don't speak for years, and when you finally do, it's in a completely different language. That alone makes the story feel unreal. But what makes it even more interesting is the background behind it. In Japan, there's a phenomenon called hikikomori. It refers to people who completely withdraw from society. Some stay in their rooms for months, some for years, and some for decades. No school, no work, no interaction, just isolation. Experts have said it became a serious social issue in Japan over time. And the man in this story, let's call him Kenji, was one of them. He reportedly started isolating himself in his early 20s after anxiety and social pressure completely overwhelmed him. At first, it was supposed to be temporary, a short break. But temporary turned into years, and years turned into a completely different life. Living in isolation changes something fundamental in the brain. At first, silence feels uncomfortable, even painful. But after a while, silence becomes normal. And that's the dangerous part. Because the brain adapts to whatever environment it stays in long enough. Kenji's world became extremely small. According to the story, his daily routine barely changed. Sleeping, eating simple food, playing old video games, and watching videos online. Mostly English videos. At first, he didn't understand anything. Native English sounded like noise. Fast, confusing, disconnected. If you've ever tried to understand real native speech, you know that feeling. It's like your brain is trying to catch smoke with your hands. But Kenji kept listening anyway. Not because he had a plan, but because silence felt worse than confusion. So he kept English videos running in the background for hours. Sometimes gaming streams, sometimes podcasts, sometimes interviews. And slowly, something started changing. Not immediately, not noticeably, but quietly. His brain began recognizing patterns, even without understanding. This is where things get interesting for language learning. Because most people think learning happens when you consciously study. But a huge part of learning actually happens passively. Your brain is constantly detecting patterns in speech, rhythm, and repetition, even when you don't realize it. Kenji didn't study grammar. He didn't memorize vocabulary lists. He just listened. For years. And something strange happened over time. Words that once sounded like noise started becoming familiar, then recognizable, then meaningful. At first, it was just small things, a repeated phrase here, a familiar word there, then sentences, then ideas. And this is where many learners misunderstand progress. Progress is not always visible. Sometimes your brain is learning long before you feel like you are learning. That's why people suddenly have breakthrough moments where everything clicks. It was building up silently the entire time. Kenji experienced that exact slow transformation, and it didn't feel like studying. It felt like background noise of life. As time passed, English stopped feeling completely foreign to him. It wasn't fluent understanding, but it wasn't confusion anymore either. it became something in between, familiar enough to follow meaning, even without full comprehension. And this is where psychology becomes important. Researchers have found something interesting about bilingual brains. People often feel emotionally different depending on the language they use. Some feel more confident in a second language. Some feel less emotionally burdened. Some feel like they become a different version of themselves. That might sound strange, but it's actually documented. Language is tied to memory and emotion. And for Kenji, Japanese was tied to pressure and past experiences. But English was different. It had no emotional history for him. No expectations. No memories of failure. Just neutral space. And that neutrality matters more than people think. Because when a language feels emotionally safe, people often express themselves more freely, even if they are not fluent. Years continued passing, and something unusual happened. Kenji didn't just start understanding English better. He started preferring it. Not consciously, but naturally. English content became his main connection to the outside world. Podcasts, videos, internet discussions, everything in English. And slowly, something changed inside his mind. He started thinking in fragments of English. Not full sentences at first, just words, expressions, sounds. That's a major step in language learning, because it means the brain is no longer translating everything. It starts building direct connections between meaning and language. No middle step, no translation layer, just direct understanding. And this is where real fluency eventually comes from. But Kenji wasn't trying to become fluent. He was just existing, and accidentally improving. Then something unexpected reportedly happened. One day, there was an incident in his apartment building. Some kind of emergency. People outside were panicking. Noise, confusion, movement everywhere. Neighbors shouting in Japanese. Kenji reportedly opened his door after hearing the commotion. And for years, no one had really heard him speak. So when someone asked him something in Japanese, he froze. And then, something strange came out. "Is everything okay?" In English. Not Japanese. English. That moment became the center of the story online. Because it didn't make logical sense at first. How do you live in Japan for years without speaking and respond in English during stress? But psychologically, there is an explanation. In extreme emotional situations, the brain sometimes switches to whatever language feels emotionally safer or more automatic. And for Kenji, English had become that space. After that moment, neighbors started noticing small changes. They would sometimes hear English audio from his apartment late at night. Repeated phrases, podcast voices, videos playing continuously. And occasionally, someone said they heard him practicing speech alone. Not Japanese, English. Over time, he began interacting more. Carefully at first. Short responses, simple communication, but mostly in English. And interestingly, reports suggested he sometimes struggled more with Japanese than English after years of isolation. That sounds strange, but it actually makes sense neurologically. Unused language pathways weaken when not activated, and isolation affects communication skills in general. Humans are social learners. Without interaction, certain parts of language ability can decline. But English, for him, was constantly active in the background, so it stayed alive in his mind. Eventually, Kenji began slowly re-entering small social situations. Not big changes, just small steps. Walking outside more, visiting shops, short conversations. But English stayed with him, and something interesting happened. He often felt more comfortable expressing himself in English than in Japanese. Not because English was better, but because it carried less emotional weight. This is something many language learners experience too. A second language can feel like a psychological shield. Mistakes feel less personal. Embarrassment feels reduced. Confidence increases slightly. And that shift can completely change communication. Because once fear decreases, expression increases. And expression is the foundation of fluency. Now, here's something important for anyone learning English. Kenji's story, real or partially exaggerated, still highlights something very real about the brain. Learning doesn't always look like studying. Sometimes it looks like exposure, repetition, background listening, and time. A lot of time. Most learners quit too early because they expect visible progress. But language learning is slow at first, then suddenly fast, then stable again, then another jump. It doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in waves. And Kenji experienced those waves over years without even realizing it, which is why he could go from silence to understanding to speaking again, not through structured learning, but through constant exposure. And maybe the most important part of this story is not about Kenji himself. It's about what it shows about the human brain. The brain adapts, even in isolation, even in silence, even in unusual environments. It finds patterns, it builds meaning, and it survives through connection, even if that connection is through a screen. For language learners, this is actually encouraging because it means you don't need perfect conditions. You don't need expensive courses. You don't need perfect discipline. You need exposure, repeated exposure. Even passive exposure counts more than people think. And over time, that exposure turns into understanding, then speaking ability, then confidence, and eventually fluency. Just like in Kenji's case, slow, invisible, but real.